Now, sometimes people ask me, Marquis de Saux, why is it that you carry a saw about with you? Well, other than playing it, obviously. My day job, I actually have a second-hand furniture store where I repair furniture. Now, I think my prices are fair. But one day, this real cheap guy came in. He saw this chair he wanted to buy. Said he wouldn't. Said the price is too high. Well, I looked him straight in the eye, and this is my reply. If I can't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. If you want it, you're gonna have to buy it. And I mean just what I said. How'd you like to find this waiting at home for you every night? Only been used once or twice. Still nice and and if I don't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. Where are you gonna find a better pair of legs like this and a back like this? Not for miles around. If I can't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. Well, it's built for comfort, made for wear and tear. Where else are you gonna find such anything care? If I can't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. Well, it's lush, plush, slick and sleek, honey. A high-class piece like this at any price is cheap. If I can't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. Look at this nice bottom. Ain't it easy on the eye? Guaranteed to support any weight or size. If I can't sell it, I'm gonna sit down on it. Ain't gonna give it away. I'm sick and tired of people walking in here wanting something for nothing. If you want it, you can reach your hand in your stash. Need some cash. If you want something for free, you can go to the Salvation Army. Don't come to me. Ready? And that is all. Hello, and welcome, you beautiful beings. My name is Lindsay May, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this Valentine's for a sumptuous erotic cabaret celebrating the fantastic Lucy Debussy and her brand new short story collection, Unspeakable Shaking Pleasures. Just to say quickly as well, thank you so much for wearing your masks. Do enjoy your drinks, but we really appreciate you wearing them and making sure that everyone can enjoy. We have some excellent performances for you tonight, including the amazing Marquis de Saux, who played us in. I'll tell you a little bit more about them and then about how the rest of the night is going to play out. Marquis de Saux is an international cabaret performer, classically trained singer, and highly skilled musical saw player, whose roots lie in Hollywood. Their powerful operatic voices wowed audiences across the UK and Europe and has earned Marquis a sterling reputation as one of Scotland's top variety performers. This saucy performer brings some sharp and edgy sass to the stage, as we've just had the chance to witness for ourselves. Please give it up again for Marquis. Now just a little rundown of the pleasures that still await. In the first half, we will be joined by a series of fabulous performers and writers sharing some scintillating words, capped by a reading from the Countess Debussy herself. There'll be a short interval to stretch your legs, buy some drinks, or whisper sweet nothings to consenting neighbours, and then we'll come back together for the second half. Marquis will join us again for some more delights, then we'll have a little Q&A with the author, and then some more wonderful words from Lucy. Once I've grilled our leading lady, Lucy and other performers will be mingling, signing, and chatting after the show on their various books, publications,
will be available from the fabulous Lighthouse Bookshop. That's my left, so that'll be your right, which will also be open during the interval. So don't be shy. Now, enough about the happy endings coming later, and back to the pleasures of the hearing. I'd like to introduce, dirty Chris. Thank you. I'd love to introduce our first reader, the impeccable Cece. Born and raised in Madrid, Cece Castrosana moved to Edinburgh 17 years ago, where she settled and found her passion for performing. She enrolled in different acting classes based on the Stanislavski method in theatre. At the end of her training, she took part in a showcase in which she performed the character of Queen Margaret from Shakespeare's Richard III. Since then, Cece has taken various roles in theatre, as well as movie and TV adverts. And tonight, she'll be treating us to a passage from Aeneas Nin. Please, Cece, come join us on the stage.
I was spending the summer in Mallorca, in Della, near the monastery where George Sand and Chopin stayed. In the early morning, we would get on small donkeys and travel the hard, difficult road to the sea, down the mountain. It would take about an hour of slow travail through the red earth paths, the rocks, the treacherous boulders, through the silver olive trees, down to the fishing villages made of huts built against the mountain flanks. Every day I went down to the cove where the sea came into a smooth round bay of such transparency that one could swim to the bottom and see the coral reefs and unusual plants. A strange story was told of the place by the fishermen. Mallorcan women were very inaccessible, puritanical, and religious. When they swam, they wore the long skirt and bathing suits and black stockings of years ago. Most of them did not believe in swimming at all and left this to the shameless European women who spent the summers there. The fishermen also condemned the modern bathing suits and obscene behavior of Europeans. They thought of Europeans as nudists who waited for only the slightest opportunity to get completely undressed and lie naked in the sun like pagans. They also looked with disapproval on the midnight bathing parties innovated by the Americans. One evening some years ago, a fisherman's daughter of 18 was walking along the edge of the sea, leaping from rock to rock, her white dress clinging to her body. Walking thus and dreaming and watching the effects of the moon on the sea, the soft lapping of the waves at her feet, she came to a hidden cove where she noticed that someone was swimming. She could see only the head moving and occasionally an arm. The swimmer was quite far away. Then she heard a light voice calling out to her. "Come and swim, it's beautiful." It was said in Spanish with a foreign accent. "Hello, Maria," it called, so the voice knew her. It must have been one of those young American women who bathed her during the day. She answered, "Who are you?" "I'm Evelyn," said the voice. "Come and swim with me." It was very tempting. Maria could easily take off her white dress and wear only her short white shoes. She looked everywhere. There was no one around. The sea was calm and speckled with moonlight. For the first time, Maria understood the European love of midnight bathing. She took off her dress. She had long black hair, a pale face, slanted green eyes, greener than the sea. She was beautifully formed, with high breasts, long legs, a stylized body. She knew how to swim better than any other woman on the island. She slid into the water and began her long, easy strokes towards Evelyn. Evelyn swam under the water, came up to her and gripped her legs. In the water, they teased each other. The semi-darkness and the bathing cap made it difficult to see the face clearly. American women had voices like boys. Evelyn wrestled with Maria, embraced her under the water. They came up at her, laughing, swimming nonchalantly away and back to each other. Maria's chemise floated up around her shoulders and hampered her movements. Finally, it came up all together, and she was left naked. Evelyn swam under and touched her playfully, wrestling and diving under and between her legs. Evelyn would part her legs so that her friend could dive between them and reappear on the other side. She floated and let her friend swim under her arched back. Maria saw that she was naked too. Then suddenly, she felt Evelyn embracing her from behind, covering her whole body with hers. The water was lukewarm, like a luxuriant pillow, so salty they bore them. helped them to float and swim without effort. "You're beautiful, Maria," said the deep voice, and Evelyn kept her arms around her. Maria wanted to float away, but she was held by the warmth of the water, the constant touch of her friend's body. She let herself be embraced. She did not feel pressed on her friends, but then she knew a young American woman she had seen did not have breasts. Maria's body was languid, and she wanted to close her eyes. Suddenly, what she felt between her legs was not a hand, but something else. Something so unexpected, so disturbing, that she screamed. This was not Evelyn, but the young man, Evelyn's younger brother, and he had slipped his erect penis between her legs. She screamed, but no one heard, and her scream was only something she has been trained to expect of herself. In reality, his embrace seemed to her as lulling and warming and caressing as the water. The water and the penis and the hands conspired to rouse her body. She tried to swim away, but the boy swam in her body, caressed, dipped her legs, and then mounted her again from behind. In the water they wrestled, but each movement affected her only more physically, made her more aware of his body against hers, of his hands upon her. The water swung her breasts back and forth like two heavy water lilies floating. He kissed them. With a constant motion, he could not really take her, but his penis touched her over and over again in the most vulnerable tip of her sex, and Maria was losing her strength. She swam toward shore, and he followed. They fell in the sand. The waves still lapped them as they lay there, panting, naked. The boy then took the girl, and the same came and washed over them and washed away the virgin blood. From that night, they met only at this hour. He took her there in the water, swaying and floating. The wave-like movements of their bodies as they enjoy each other seemed part of the sea. They found a foothold in a rock and stood together, caressed by the waves and shaken from the orgasm. When I went down to the beach at night, I often felt as though I could see them, swimming together and making love.
Thank you, Susie, for that fabulous rendition. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our next reader, Megan. Megan Flaherty writes non-fiction, mostly about herself, which is not particularly sexy, but I say that in the same way that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, basically anything can be sexy in the right context, right? Her first book, Tango Lessons, was published in the US in 2018. Her second is coming soon and features no toe sucking, a tidbit of information that opens many questions that I hope Megan will explain later on in the book. Please welcome Megan.
So I'm pretty sure I'm here for the comic relief. Having written a book about tango, people generally think that I am sexy and that I can do a sexy dance and that tango itself is a sexy dance. But as someone who learned to dance tango in New York City in my 20s, I came to find out that it was really just a bunch of lonely people in fluorescent lit gymnasiums smelling vaguely of garlic and halitosis. So I tried to convince everybody in my life that actually sexless little weirdo Meg was not actually doing what you see on Strictly, and that what I was doing was quite awkward and sweet and really like tiny little movements with the feet and really not sexy at all. There's no sex in it, I swear, it's not sexy, it's not sexy. The toe sucking came just after this. This was private lessons with a tanguero maestro. We'd finished running through the choreography for the performance. I sat there stretching, bending over hamstrings, elongating my calves. I took off my practice shoes and rotated tired circles with my ankles. "Here," he said, and took my foot, began massaging. I remember thinking that stopping him might be insulting. He started to peel off my sock. I pulled away. He held on and pulled me by the foot across the floor. My butt slid easily in yoga pants. My white fish of a foot was in his lap. There. I should have stopped it, slapped him, or ventriloquized a ringtone from the cell phone in my purse. I should have run, but I was sure he wouldn't push. A foot rub, generous, benign. He raised it to his lap, kept on rubbing. I tried to speak, diffuse the moment with my nervous chatter, found that I could not. He bent down and in seconds rested the whole of his lower lip across my sweaty digits, as if about to play harmonica. And then he started breathing on me. He lowered the hot cave of his mouth over my foot, and I just sat there, paralyzed, staring mutely at him, determined not to blink. I would not show my revulsion or betray the humid feeling that was surging up my legs in spite of me. My toes were in his mouth. This was too far. I had let it go too far. I extricated myself and my feet as politely as I could. I did not stay for post-practice pierogi. I did not let him drive me home. I went and I waited for the local E-train, sitting on a concrete slab in the empty station, staring at my lap, nauseated and ashamed. I told you it was creepy, nagged my mother's voice inside my head. I told you to be careful. In hindsight, maybe it was funny. Maybe I should have run home to tell Peter, my sexless boyfriend, that some old cad with half a mullet who'd been trying to nail me for the past 3 months had just tried to suck my toes. Maybe I should have found it perfectly ridiculous, how thoroughly I'd failed to grasp the situation, how I had stumbled in my criminal naivete, perhaps unwittingly encouraged him. But I was mortified. It was the single most erotic moment of my 20s, and it was wrong, all wrong. A nadie le confíes, I repeated to myself, and suddenly, ardently, wanted him to disappear into that secret world so I could seal him in with wet cement, just like I'd done with every other shame. Bury it deep and build again. Tell no one. Fortify another castle, crystalline and pure.
Thank you, Megan. I don't think I'll be looking at your sucking quite the same way ever again. Now, next we have special guest, Sarita. Sarita Domingo is the author of The Three of Us, originally published as The Nearness of You, a creator, editor, and contributing writer of romantic fiction anthology Who's Loving. Her novel, If I Don't Have You, was shortlisted for the Diverse Book Awards 2021. She's also written numerous erotic short stories and an erotic novella with Pavilion Books, and has appeared on BBC Women's Hour and Sky Arts Book Club and many more, and now she's here with us. Please join. Give it up. First, thank you.
You'll have to forgive me, I've got a problem with my vocal cord at the moment, so I'm a bit hoarse. I'll make it work. We'll say it sexy. I'm actually Lucy's editor, and I have the pleasure of publishing Unspeakable Shaking Pleasures, which I hope you'll read and enjoy. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Lucy. So I am going to read an extract from a story called Ritual, which I wrote a staggering number of years ago. And it's been a while since I've read it, so we'll enjoy it together. I twist the taps and soon the water starts to flow and steam starts to envelop me. As the tub fills and the water settles, I pour a generous quantity of the bath oil and watch the beads mingle and settle gently on the top of the water. I trace my finger in amongst them, creating tiny ripples across the surface. Then I slowly hook my fingers into the sides of my panties and unfurl them down the length of my legs until they are a curled pile of soft white cotton around my ankles. I flick them away with my feet and luxuriate in at last being totally naked, with your words swirling inside my mind. I step into the tub and sit down into it, enjoying the sting of hot water against my bottom. I lay my body down into the length of the bath so that my head rests against the edge and my toes tickle the chain leading down to the plug. The water is just shallow enough that my breasts bob out of it, slick with the bath oil. I sway from side to side, letting the water tickle against my still hard nipples, and then duck my head under the water to wet my hair. When I resurface, little droplets begin to trace their way down from the strands of my hair, down my shoulders and chest, and melt into the warm water. I don't use a sponge, nothing, just my hands. I start from my toes, working my fingers between each one. They slip in easily with the oily water. I start to work my fingertips down the centers of the soles of my feet, then smooth the palm of my hands over each heel, and then up, down and around my lower calves, one then the other, lifting each of them out of the water and towards me. I have to concentrate not to focus too much on the sensation of the water lapping against my pussy, which spreads open ever so slightly whenever I raise a leg out of the tub. Instead, I allow my fingers to trace small circles at the backs of my knees for a moment. And for a split second, it almost feels like your fingers instead of mine. I close my eyes as my hands begin to slip their way up the insides of my thighs. I can't stop myself from spreading my legs open, each foot pressed against the sides of the tub. My hands almost reach the top, and so I slow down. I mustn't. I'm inching my fingertips gradually, so slowly, up towards, no, that's not what you said should happen now.
Thank you, Sarita. That was gorgeous. And as Sarita mentioned, not only is she a wonderful writer, she's here tonight with her other hat on, and as editorial director of Trapeze Books and the women responsible for bringing us this marvelous edition. So double thanks to Sarita. And speaking of Miss Debussy, I think it's about time we heard from the women of the hour. Lucy Debussy was born one unholy night in a room above the La Venezia Sherry Bar in Madrid. Her work's been published in Erotic Review, Best Women's Erotica, and the Mammoth Book of Best New Erotica, and performed at London's legendary erotic soiree, Velvet Tongue. Lucy Debussy is a pseudonym, and now it's time to welcome her to the stage. Please give it up for Lucy.
Thank you very much for all coming out tonight on Valentine's night. Best Valentine's ever for me. Normally Alex and I just get a chippy in an iron brew. One time we were feeling exceptionally bougie and we mixed our iron brew with Prosecco and called it a Dalrye Bellini. But the new bar has been set. I'm going to read from a story called Mary Lou. It's one of the first stories that I wrote actually in what became Unspeakable Shaking Pleasures. It's about sailors. There were 8 sailors who worked in the stokehold. 4 ordinary stokers, 1 chief stoker, 1 checkman, and a petty stoker's officer. Mary Lou was one of the stokers, but she called herself Max when she was on board. She strapped her breasts down with cotton bandages and worked her biceps every evening with cans of tomatoes to keep them hard. She wore short-sleeved shirts to show off the bulk of her arms, and sometimes she stuffed a single folded sock down the front of her panties. She had dodged her way through the sign-up by pretending she had a testosterone deficiency. It kept her voice high. When it came time to go to the bathroom, she would make sure the coast was clear and use the cubicle. Sometimes she had to be patient, and if they were drinking beer in the crew mess, her discomfort could last for hours. She regretted that she could not stand next to her fellow sailors at the urinals because she had great curiosity about the intimate parts of their bodies. Mary Lou had always had great curiosity about sailors' bodies. Her father had owned a small, shabby tattoo parlor in a small, shabby port town in the west of Oahu, and she'd grown up watching men with chests far too bronzed and big and hard for their faces, clenching their jaws while the needle buzzed into their perspiring skin. They'd spoken English to her father, but they cursed in their mother tongues when the needle hurt. Their faces and hair, their eyes and skin and tattoos, and the cut of their clothes were also different. Mary Lou soon took it upon herself as a game to be able to guess at their country before they opened their mouths. Sometimes, when she was folding her uniform at the foot of her bunk, she would hear the sailors talking in their own languages to themselves, a night prayer or a sigh of relief as they unbuttoned their uniforms. And she would look from the side of her eye and catch a glimpse of one of them, a thigh covered in wiry hair, a belly button, a brown flank, a smooth, lazy cock. If they were in warmer waters, the men would sleep topless, their sheets tossed to the foot of the bunk, and Mary Lou would admire the different bronzes and peaches and browns of their shoulders and chests. There was one in particular she liked to look at. He was Romanian and spoke English with an accent that was so cut glass and fine, his words might have shattered if you caught them in your hand. He had hair the colour of treacle, skin that glowed creamy in the dark. He had impeccable manners. He tipped his hat to ladies in port. He was immaculately turned out. He loved, it seemed, to enact the ritual of the perfect sailor, and she loved when she had the chance to watch the attention and care he took when grooming himself, combing the parting in his hair or cleaning his teeth. His clothes were always folded and pressed, as if he'd ironed them onto the contours of his body. Mary Lou imagined that his skin underneath the thick blue twill would be just as immaculate, just as smooth. She thought that up close his body must smell of the same warm cotton soap as his clothing. The sailors all had a favourite among their number. Mary Lou would watch in the bar each night as pairs formed off 2 by 2 as they sipped beer and cracked the shells of monkey nuts. When they got into port, they would go in 2s and 3s to the brothels. She often wondered what it must be like to be one of the dockside prostitutes, to take so many men in one night, men who had so much excitement in them, to feel them passing through one by one, like the men in her father's tattoo parlour. It would be impossible not to notice their differences, not to steal a souvenir of each of them, a word or a scent, a single hair that had rubbed off their bodies, or to twist from their uniforms when they weren't looking, a button as small as a nipple. And it would be impossible, she thought, not to be aroused by that quantity of appetite, that glut, not to feel it slipping through the red raw flesh and into the blood, a pain that had so much urgency. They lived in cabins with bunks of 4. Mary Lou slept on the bottom. When it came time to disrobe for bed, she usually waited until the men were all asleep or distracted, and in she went to the little bathroom. There she would unwind the binding on her breasts, ease them from their bandages, rub the soreness out of them, and dress herself in a loose pajama top. Sometimes she found her nipples sensitive from the pressure of being bound down all day, and the lightness of the loose cotton brushing them would be almost unbearable. She would rub oil up and down herself in brisk strokes from a little bottle that she replenished in the different ports. Olive oil, almond, sometimes an oil whose name she did not know. Like a mermaid, she slipped off the solid legs of the stoker mats and came back to Mary Lou's wet scales. Then she would slide into bed with her breasts under a loose t-shirt. The men were all on varying contracts, which meant that the bunk formation could change without notice. Mary Lou came back from the bathroom one day to find the Romanian sailor in her cabin, sitting up in bed with his back to her. She knew it was him because she had stared so many times at the back of his neck. She knew intimately the line where his shoulders centered in a crease of muscle, where his hair faded into his skin. His back was the color of fresh cream, the disc on the top of a bottle of milk, speckled with brown blemishes that she had an almost irrepressible urge to pierce with a needle. Desire shivered like a fish down her body. From then on, she slept in the bunk underneath him. Every night she would lie looking up, imagining the shape of him imprinting on the mattress above, trying to see where his weight was falling and the lines of his arms, his back, his thighs, his head. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow. Okay, another huge round of applause for Lucy, please. And for all of the Now I will release you for a few moments, 10 minutes to wet your whistles, wet your appetites, and then we'll see you back here for more fun.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. This looks so good. So good. I mean, yeah. But find your That's right.
I put a spell on you because you're mine. Better stop the things you're doing. I ain't lying. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. The way you're running around. No, I can't stand it. The way you look me down. I put a spell on you because you're Again, another huge round of applause for the fantastic Martina. And I'm also delighted to say that we're now going to have a chat with the fabulous Lucy Debussy herself. Please come and join me as we delve a little deeper into the stories behind the story.
This is why I'm not a real burlesque performer, because I wouldn't be able to manage all of the timing or anything. I would pop on the stage too early and, thank you very much.
It's beautiful. So first of all, Lucy, I want to say congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very welcome. This isn't your first book, but it is your first erotica collection. And
It
what
is.
a fabulous one it is. Now I have lots of things I'd like to quiz Lucy on, but we're also keen on sharing. So we will open up to questions from the audience in a little bit, so start thinking now. So Lucy, one of the things that's so striking about Unspeakable Shaking Pleasures is just how perfectly it centres the female experience, and not to the exclusion of the male or to any gender, but in a very simultaneous way. Can you tell me like a little bit more about your delivery here? Was that perfect?
I suppose it becomes on purpose. It's kind of not retrospectively, but when you look at the collection of the whole, you sort of see or feel a theme going through it. So I don't know if it's deliberate per se that when I sit down to write an erotica story, I've got a feminist agenda, but it's definitely, I tend to just follow the adage that write what you want to read. And a lot of the erotica that I've read will either center the female experience, but it will follow quite a kind of, like a conventional narrative, a conventional power dynamic. And sometimes basically a lot of my fiction writing is fan fiction, or me trying to emulate the people that I like reading. And I think, but wanting to do something different with that. And so, erotica it's a genre that I've always been interested in. I've always been passionate about. And I think I've always just wanted to write something that kind of both calls on and draws on those influences, but puts my own kind of stamp into them, puts that personality, that sort of sense of what I'm interested in exploring or reading.
Absolutely, you can definitely feel that. And talking about things that you're interested in, like another thing that I love about the book is the sheer inventiveness of the settings and also the fascinating historical details. And personally, I adore how many of the characters are artists or artisans or bakers or makers of one kind or another. So I have to ask, are any of the characters based on like real people or performers?
Are any of the characters based on real people?
Historical part as a blind for asking if any of your friends are in it.
Do you know, I asked you the same question in a book launch, in your book launch, and I remember you had a really incredibly diplomatic answer, and I'm trying to think of it, I don't remember it all. On the historical characters, there's definitely historical settings, I think, that have influenced the stories more than characters per se. And it's my projection of like, what might somebody whose story we haven't read in that era say, or what might they be exploring? But actually, like, having laughed at the idea that I will admit to the characters in the stories being based on real people, some of them are, and definitely based on my love of burlesque performance. In one of my other guises as a writer, I do a lot of dance reviewing for the List magazine, and dance is something, or watching dance and writing about dance was something that I fell into by accident. And just like, I absolutely love the way dance, it takes you out of yourself into a completely different space. You see something that's not necessarily narrative, that's more like poetry, I suppose. And that's definitely, that sort of surrealism, that kind of sense of the strange has definitely had an influence. And that's come kind of direct from life. And also I saw a lot of burlesque and circus in my capacity as a dance journalist as well. And so that's obviously directly played in. I'm very interested in the idea of the circus and what the circus symbolizes. But also that sort of sense of like play and heightened reality and things that are larger than life kind of feeds, I think, across the board into all of the stories. But I do also steal details from life. I think we talked about that a little bit in relation to your own work. And like, I was thinking about this the other day, actually, about one of the stories features a character that's wearing these two beautiful pearl earrings. And those I stole from a waiter in a cafe where I was working. They were just this really, really beautiful member of the serving team. And they had stunning earrings on, so I put them in my book.
Were like, you were going in my book?
I was, yes. Beep, you're going in my book. Yeah.
That was worth the price of the coffee.
Absolutely.
So would you were talking about burlesque performance there, obviously the Marquis de Sade, it's amazing. Do you have any people now that you would recommend or that you've seen recently? And are there any historical performers that you just wish that you would have had the chance to see?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, historical performers. I mean, I've always had like a love of the kind of great Hollywood sirens as well, like Marilyn Monroe, I think, and her comedy is something as well that I think I really, really love in her work, and I think has probably had an influence in my own work as well. There's always a sense of sort of play and lightness. Yeah, in terms of sort of burlesque performers as well, I mean, Mata Hari and any of the kind of 1920s or later golden age belly dancers definitely have always kind of captured and caught my imagination. It's that sense of like belly dancing, which I studied a little bit when I was at university. It's such a kind of precise, disciplined skill, and yet all of that discipline goes into making this incredible sense of like the mystique and the exotic. And I love that juxtaposition of, I think that things, which I think is probably also what I admire in circus as well, this idea you go to these great, incredible lengths to create something that looks just like it's been dreamt, you know, rather than lived. Yeah, and sorry, you were asking. I'm like, oh, I'm rambling.
Often when reading, especially some of the more historical ones and the performers, I get that like urge to go and Google and watch the YouTube video or something. And so that's perfect.
Yeah, karaoke actually. There's a lot of YouTube and Samia Gamal, two Golden Age belly dancers. There's a lot of YouTube videos of both of them, and they're really stunning. But also, it's not just that they themselves are brilliant dancers, but they create this kind of like Golden Age Egyptian cinema had this kind of quite like burlesque. Everything was sort of larger than life, or like very surreal and dreamlike. And so yeah, I definitely recommend checking them out on YouTube.
Perfect. So definitely, I mean, there's a real physicality to the professions of the characters, not just the performers in your book, which I think creates this amazing sort of well-roundedness and also is a great contrast to the thing. I mean, was that something that you were conscious of? Did you feel, you know, you're writing about the baking or working on a ship, were you like feeling the physicality and crosses over?
I think there's a lot of like the senses in all of my work, and I think that that's always something that's interested me. And interestingly, the older I get, the less visually interested I am, and the more interested I am in things like touch and scent, a lot more. But yeah, the way different spaces kind of excite your senses in different ways. Also, I think when you're out of your comfort zone, like literally when you're traveling, for example, when you go to a different place, that's when your senses become more heightened. You know, you're not just taking in the same sensory information that you see on a daily basis, but you might be smelling a very particular type of bread or perfumes, or, you know, in airports, I always find that my senses are quite kind of heightened, probably because I'm panicking about missing flights, but also because, you know, you just have this sense of like the strange. And yeah, and I think that certainly in relation to the Mary Lou story, it's kind of interesting that my kind of fascination with sailors came from working for the National Trust for Scotland. So I worked in their cruises teams. We got to go away to sea for 3 weeks of the year, and it's a fascinating life. I think that sense of being like packed close to each other. Sorry, microphone too close. Packed close to each other, living in very confined quarters. That really kind of does something to your mind. I mean, I was only there for 3 weeks at a time, but you know, for the people that were kind of living on the ship and stuff, that sense of intimacy that you get working alongside, and to me, mixed with my like fascination for anything that's sort of vintage or golden ages, or sort of classic or dreamlike, mixed with that kind of lived reality, I suppose, to create something that was a little bit strange.
So you don't think about maybe hitting up the National Trust for Scotland as a sponsor for Mary Lou?
Oh my goodness, can you imagine? There's so much, but that's the thing, there's so much like sensory, beautiful beauty in history, I think. And like, I mean, I haven't yet, but going around old houses and castles, many of which are owned by the National Trust for Scotland, there's so much beauty in like antique furniture, I think. And there's just so many stories to be found in those places as well. So I can absolutely envisage them inspiring further stories as an organization.
I like this idea.
I like the idea of sponsoring.
And I think we're talking about the historical settings. You think like setting erotica in these times where like societal norms are different to the way that we experience them now makes the process easier or more difficult?
Great.
I think it makes it easier, for me anyway, it makes it easier to write, for me to write erotica set in the past, because then it becomes a purely imaginative exercise. I also, like when I started writing erotica, I was never intending, I mean, it would have been a dream of mine, but I was never really intending it to be, I never thought it would happen as to be a part of a collection. So I kind of, you know, it wasn't like I sort of set myself the agenda to always write in the past. It was more like kind of, this is where my senses are drawing me, and I'm fascinated by the past because it's somewhere that you just can't go to. And yeah, and by the way in which these objects or these ideas or these sort of dreamlike ideas of history, particularly of the dreamlike ideas we have of particular eras, like, you know, if you were to conjure up in your mind's eye a picture of like Victorian Paris, no offense, like Fond de Cycle, I can't pronounce it, Karen's gonna laugh at me. How do you say it? Fond de Cycle, Fin de siècle, yeah, very smooth. Paris, that kind of thing. You know, you instantly have an idea in your head, or you know, Weimar Berlin or something like that. And I think, yeah, just kind of like really the freedom of not thinking, well, this is going to be a collection one day. I think gave me the freedom to just literally abandon all the kind of adherence to research and the rigor that I put into my historical fiction and just go where my imagination took me. Really.
Yeah, I was going to ask because you do also enjoy the research angle, yeah. I know for sure. But I was going to ask, does it make it trickier writing erotica and also researching and knowing there's going to be a pedant in the audience at some point? It's going to be like, that's not quite how they did their gussets.
I would love it. An erotica pedant. Oh yes, that's a niche fetish. Yeah, no, less so because I'm just like, well, it's my imagination for this. But yeah, that definitely like, oh gosh, yes, that gives me sleepless nights when I'm writing historical fiction because also I think like the type of audience that you get in historical fiction, people come to historical fiction because they want to learn about the past, whether or not that's a kind of misnomer that historical authors, or whether historical authors have a responsibility to stick to as much of a version of the truth as possible. Yeah, is a question, is a completely different question, but certainly when it comes to erotica, I think for me anyway, this particular collection, there was a freedom in thinking I'm going to research it because I'm interested in it, or actually some of my erotica stories have been byproducts of researching the novels as well, like the Harp and Hope Boy. That was a byproduct of a novel I've written that's coming out later in the year. But it's that chance, because sometimes when you're writing a novel, you'll notice yourself, you've got your kind of you've got your kind of structure, your drive, your thread, you're pushing through, and there's so many tangents you maybe want to go on but just can't because it doesn't serve the story that you're writing. There's so many directions that you want to let your imagination kind of go in, but you can't because you're trying to serve the story you're writing. And yeah, I think with this particular collection, I didn't have any of those sorts of, I didn't feel any of those restrictions. I really felt a lot of freedom, a lot of creative freedom in writing this. And also, do you know what? It was really nice not to write about people being murdered for a change.
Right. People just here for a good time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was, yeah.
Yeah, we've talked in the past about short fiction as well, the freedom that you have there, like maybe playing with language a little bit more or feeling freer to explore other ideas that sometimes don't fit into the structure of a longer work. Do you feel that you were able to be a little more inventive overall in the shorter collection?
I think there's definitely, when I write short fiction, then I think there's definitely an adherence to the idea of it. It's like, to me, it's closer to poetry than, not that I write poetry since my teenage years, but it feels closer to poetry than to novel writing. I feel like definitely when I write a short story, there's a pleasure in going over and over again and sort of almost sanding the language. and really trying to sort of make every word count, really trying to kind of like refine and hone and listen and feel the rhythms. Also, when I write short fiction, a lot of the time, less so now, but certainly in the past, you know, back in the golden age of Edinburgh's spoken word scene, often at times I did have the intention that I was going to be performing them, reading them aloud, and so that was always in my mind as well, which isn't necessarily in my mind when I'm writing a novel. But I enjoy that kind of focus. It's just a different type of working, I think, to be able to sort of give yourself permission to work so closely on the language and on the sound of the story as well, that maybe, you know, if you were to, you just don't have time to kind of do that throughout a whole novel, maybe.
No, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the way we as a society look at erotica now, or at least sex in general, compared to some of these other eras that you've written about. Did you find that quite liberating, exciting, interesting, depressing?
Well, so I'm reading an interesting book at the moment. It's a collection, or it's a collation by a woman called Sherwood Hussein. It's the Virago book of erotic myths and legends. Cannot recommend it highly enough. It's the best erotica I've read in ages, and it's all it's retellings of ancient erotic myths, right? You know, globally. So there's ancient Persian erotic myths, there's ancient Indian, Chinese, there's Greek, there was I think there's some Lancelot Guinevere in there too. But yeah, it's just, yeah, that's just really brilliant. And she's written a really interesting introduction where she talks about that exact question, about how we've got at some point then, we as a society decided that sex was somehow taboo to talk about. And you know, these stories, these, you know, Sumerian erotic poems that just rhapsodize about Inanna's beautiful vulva, you know, prove that there was a time in which that was not the case, and that there wasn't, you know, that it was imbued with this sense of great spirituality and art. And I do think that that's changed. I do think that it's bizarre, the taboo that exists around sex that does not exist around violence. You know, like I've got two small children, and when I think about you know, some of the things that just pass muster on mainstream television or in books that are highly visible, you know, crime fiction's an enormous genre. Like I love crime fiction, I write it, I read a lot of it. I don't think that there should be censorship. I'm not sort of saying let's have one and not the other, but yeah, I do think that we are living through a period where, depending on which kind of, I suppose it depends a little bit on which like kind of circles you move in and which kind of art you kind of engage with. I was having a little bit of a chat about this actually with the Marquis de Sade backstage, talking about taboos about sex in performance or sex in art. And when you kind of are exposed to quite a lot of like burlesque and circus and dance, where I think sex is more visible, perhaps visual art, then yeah, you kind of don't really see what the issue is. But there is, and I don't know why it is, though. I can't answer that one.
I'm not expecting.
No.
You answer the entire problems of society. Although if you would like to,
I would love to. I would love to.
I'd like to talk to you briefly about pseudonyms and what they mean, what they signify. I mean, like, my name is that I use for writing isn't my legal name, but that was the personal exclusive. I know, but it's now the name that I'm known by the majority of people that I know, because I've just stuck with it for so long. And that, you know, people take different names for lots of different reasons, and I wanted to chat to you about, you know, your reasoning and your enjoyment of your pseudonym.
I do enjoy a pseudonym. I do. I know. My agent Stacey said I should stop at 3. I do, but it's for me. So it's
Long-suffering agent.
I know, right? I know. Little does she know what I've got planned next. For me, it like becomes part of the theatre of the book, you know. And there is, but although I'm not going to lie, like the first short stories that I published as Lucy Debussy predated anything that I got published under my own name. They were in Erotic Review, which I really highly rate. It's being relaunched soon, actually. as a kind of art magazine, a sort of print magazine, because it went online for a while. And I published them under the name Lucy Debussy, partly because I wanted a burlesque name, but also partly because I was working for the National Trust for Scotland at the time, and I thought that you know, I've got a very unusual name. I thought it would come up in the Google searches, you know, in case. I mean, to be honest, now I'm looking back on it, I'm like, if anyone was Google stalking me, that's surely weirder than writing erotica. But yeah, so it sort of started those two prongs. But it's the same with my psychological fiction name, psychological thriller name, Elle Connell. When I had the opportunity, no publisher, I should say, no publisher has ever pressured me into using a pseudonym for my work for branding purposes. It's something that I've chosen to do, not necessarily for branding or marketing, which I know can sometimes happen with authors, but more just because I feel like it's a different character that I'm writing in, or it's a different type of writing. And I just like that, like I say, this idea of the theatre, of the performance of writing. I like the idea that for the type of erotica that I'm writing, which is very much rooted in fantasy, in larger than life, in burlesque, in dreamland, that to have a name that kind of conjures that up as well, like was it was quite important to me for like the book overall. But you know, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't also worried about the taboo and the stigma and the thing, you know, the taboo that exists around writing erotica. So that definitely played into it as well. But every time I thought, you know what, I should probably, and I did think in the past year, several times, do you know what, I'm going to write an email and say this should probably be coming out under my own name because maybe it'll be taken more seriously. And I would just think no, because that's not, you know, it's not what this collection is about. And the pseudonym is just such a big part of it for me. Lucy Debussy is.
It started as Debussy. So
yes, exactly.
Perfect. Yeah. Amazing. I see that soon I will open it up to the audience for questions because we're running out of time. But first, I would like to ask you a little bit about your first time. I will start with the first erotica that you read, saw, or recognised as erotica.
Since this is being live streamed, then I can definitely say it was on my parents' bedroom bookshelves. I'd clocked they had an ASN copies, and I was kind of curious about why they weren't on the main study bookshelves. But actually, also I remember hearing I wrote an essay about this recently. I remember hearing a lot of chatter about the 90s TV adaptation of Lady Chatterley's Lover that was causing, I don't know, pearl clutching in 90s suburban Fife. And I really was like, oh, what is this about? What is Lady Chatterley's Lover about? And so I remember when my parents went on holiday and left me and my brother on our own for the first time. I don't know, I must have been about 14 or 15 or so. And I was like, right, I'm going to read that one. And I devoured it. And like, I have a really kind of odd relationship with D.H. Lawrence now, because I think, you know, he's, yeah. and like, I reread that book several years later and was like, oh no. And just all of the sort of like the adoration of like the penis and all this sort of weird spiritual kind of rhythm that he gets into, and that I find those sort of simultaneously intoxicating from a rhythmic point of view, but also, yeah, like no. But he also I think probably did influence the idea of sex as spirituality that has come through in different forms in my work. I'd say the first erotica author that I fell in love with was Anne, though. I mean, I remember reading her collection, which I sort of had for a while and kind of hadn't got around to reading it. And we were in Catalonia and living at the time, and I took it down to the beach at Port one day and was like, oh, it was just bliss. Like I was transported, absolutely transported.
Amazing. And can you remember the first time that you wrote or performed your own erotic stories?
Oh, well, I do remember the first story I wrote. So the fake biography of me is not entirely fake. I think I'd written a story for Erotic Review by this point, but I went to Spain to visit my friend Carrick, who was staying in Spain at the time. He was living there in Madrid, and we were in the Valencia Sherry Bar, and we were challenging each other to write erotic fiction. And I have the story.
Am I allowed to read it? I think he can stop you. Because there, so, you know.
Well, listen, right, I am going to read the one, in all fairness, I am going to read the story that I wrote later, but I'm going to have to take my gloves off and do like a very inelegant glove reveal.
I was going to ask them to provide music.
This is why I'm writing about burlesque and not performing it.
Help.
No, you're right. So here we go. This is untitled, actually, I have to say. I've kept it for all these years. Should I preface it by telling you that it's about a couple called Lucy and Alex? His penchant for ass, the eyes always dropped to the lower waist, and no matter what, he found his visual pleasure. Brown leather belts, the denim lining, writing is awful, the denim lining that patched the cloth together, pronouncing bubble butts, or the vacuum that tempted the imagination more, a double whammy that made his desire swell for more, for both taste and touch. But Lucy, his wife, would always tug his arm at this point, pulling him away from his thoughts towards the high street window. Do you think in this? She asked, hoping his passion for her would return. Fuck off, he thought, but just shrugged as if to say, I suppose so. They entered. The shop buzzed with people milling around for the post-Christmas bargains. He spotted the doorman, the teller, the other miserable husbands in the store, and always the eyes dropped to the lower waist.
You can write it in your book.
Yeah, I let him write it in my book, of course. I treasure this.
My goodness.
So that was really the origin of Lucy Debussy, was us kind of larking about, and Carrick has always been incredibly encouraging to me, which is why the book's dedicated to him. He's always really encouraged me in erotic writing, given me a lot of confidence in my work, and so thank you.
And appeared today unexpectedly.
Yes, I know, and appeared today.
Which is fantastic. So you said you were going to be reading the one
Yes.
Is that the first story that you wrote from this collection? Or is there another
not
one?
so I think, if I'm remembering rightly, so it was around about that time that I had The Woman on the High Wire and The Taste published a bioerotic review, and it's possible that I might have actually had Women on High Wire published by that point, and that was what got us starting about, well, should I do this? Should I? But yeah, the taste was really the first erotica story where I thought, oh, I really want to write more of this because it's interesting and you can go to interesting places with it that aren't just about sort of writing about a scenario where two people meet and get on.
Amazing. Right, I have more questions here, but also I would like to give the audience the chance to ask any questions. Please don't be shy. Stick your hand up, and we don't have a mic at the moment, so if you could yell, that would be. Oh, we do have a mic, so
can you
lying
hear
to you. So please do raise a hand. Grab the mic. Yeah, this one. Hi, thank you so much. You've been wonderful tonight. I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the emotional catharsis and the mental health side of writing erotica that's not necessarily erotic, but both reading and writing erotica can have such a wonderful benefit to your emotional, your spiritual, as you mentioned, health, and kind of the catharsis, I guess I would say, that comes from that.
That's a fantastic point, I think, actually, yes. And I think that really, really ties into what I was saying earlier when I said it very flippantly, but it is that there's a depth to that, it was, returning to this collection it felt incredible to be writing this when I'm used to writing so many things that are dark. And I do think that there's I think what it is, because I think that could apply to any kinds of fiction writing. I think that any kind of fiction, or indeed I only say fiction because that's my medium, but narrative non-fiction as well. Anything where you kind of go to explore either yourself or explore others, or explore yourself through looking at others, or explore the general human experience, I think is very good for your mental health. And I think, yeah, but I do think, particularly with writing erotica, then it's a sense of sort of freedom in saying something, or being able to express something in words that you've maybe kind of had the feeling of, but weren't quite sure what it meant. Or for me, a lot of the times my work starts with something that I'm fascinated by, and writing the story is how you kind of try and unpick that fascination. And I think, I think there is actually an element of catharsis in that, and where it's good for your mental health, I think, because I think it's a form of anything that expresses things that are inside you is good for your mental health. But thank you, that's a really, really lovely point to bring up.
It was a fantastic question. Not to put any pressure on the next person.
Right.
Raises their hand, please. All questions are welcome.
While you're having a think, wave your hand when you're ready, but there are 2 online, so I'll just do one after the others. One from Shell, which is your favorite / the hottest story in the collection?
Good question. Ooh, oh my goodness. This is like, there's one time when Carrick was hosting one of my book launches, and he genuinely asked me the question, who's your favorite child? Yeah, oh my goodness, my favorite or the hottest. Actually, do you know what? I'm gonna sort of slightly turn that question on its head, because I was talking with Alex, my other half, earlier about some of the stories in the collection that I feel slightly unconvinced by, where I've approached them from a kind of more of a sort of intellectual or exploratory point of view, rather than something that's taking me where I've kind of felt them. And they tend to be the more kind of BDSM type stories, like the paddles, where I've had, I've kind of, it's given me a freedom to sort of like let loose with language and showboat and explore just the joys of it. But I was worried that those stories would come off as superficial. Stories that I've had a real kind of, stories I had a real kind of connection to. Well, I suppose it was Mary Lou. It was my fascination with sailors, not only with sailors, but with masculinity, and like masculinity en masse in general. And also The Ecstasy was a story that I really felt when I was writing it. It's about a woman who's chosen a very particular path in life. The Ecstasy is a story within a story, but it's about a woman who's chosen a very particular path in life. She's a nun, and living in a kind of unnamed medieval time period. And she's a renowned artist, and she's commissioned to create a life-size sculpture of Christ. And the model that she uses, she begins to have erotic feelings for, which are incredibly as powerful as her spiritual love of God. And so the two kind of go into battle, I suppose, with each other. And that was a story that I really felt was writing it.
Is there anyone else in the room? There's another one online. So while you think, yeah, I will ask this one, and then I will come back for you two. This one is from Cara. How do you navigate taboo? Was there any sultry ground that you didn't dare delve into for any particular reason?
That's a really good question. Was there anything that I didn't delve into? Any subject that I didn't delve into? No, I think in terms of how you would navigate taboo, I would have this is why it's really important to have a really good relationship with your editor and with your agent, and to trust them, because I think if that had come up, then I would have spoken to Sarita about it and had a conversation. There were things I think that we did talk about in the book where we sort of thought, it was very important in the Mary Lou story. I remember some of Sarita's edits were about consent and about making sure, this is a story that I suppose it does to a certain extent touch on kind of role play and dominant submissive role play. And so it was very important to us, and Sarita really kept me on the right track in terms of making sure that it was clear that Mary Lou, the character, was really embracing this, was really up for it. She was really in control, despite the fact that she's in control, entering a situation where she is sometimes, it seems like she's not in control. So I think that would be the answer to it. I don't think there is a subject that I wouldn't touch. There's probably a lot of, I mean, this collection is probably incredibly vanilla to people who are used to reading about kink and who are very well versed in the kink scene, I think. And so I'm sure there are lots of taboos and subjects that I haven't come up against yet. I haven't yet come up against one that I would be put off writing about, but it's entirely possible that there are lots that I just haven't written about because I'm too sweet and innocent to know about them yet. But if I do, then I will.
You keep saying yet.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you're always exploring, always learning. That's the beauty of reading, not just erotica, but any books.
I'm actually very intrigued and following this line of questioning. It's a two-part question. When did you decide, okay, this is the collection now, I have like a range of subjects, and also how do you mix these subjects? How do you decide, okay, today I'm writing about a singer, and tomorrow, I'm going to write about being out in the Spanish Ocean?
Oh, amazing question. Anyone would think you were an editor. Thank you, Rachel. That's a brilliant question. Sorry, I did say Rachel is my novel editor. Yeah. So how do I veer? How did I decide the collection as a whole? Well, we actually had a larger collection, a larger and more rambling collection of stories, some of which I had written as Lucy Debussy, some of which I had written under my own name, but that explored sex, that touched on sex, that sort of interwove with sex as a theme. And Daisy and I sent all of the stories that we thought might fit the theme of an erotica collection to Sarita. And Sarita has X-ray vision and picked out, literally without being told, every single one of the ones that were Lucy Debussy, and said, these are the ones I think I want in the collection. The other ones I think just aren't quite, for some reason, they aren't quite sort of coming off. They aren't quite gelling with the idea of erotica, even though they feature sex. And then we talked about, because we then talked about me writing some more stories for that, and Sarita also helped me to see what was a kind of overarching theme in the collection, the idea of women stepping into their sexual power. It hadn't, like I was saying earlier, in answer to your question, Lindsay, it hadn't actually really kind of occurred to me to have a kind of overarching idea or agenda that's present when I sit down to write, but sometimes you need somebody else to like look at your work and say, this is what's coming through. So with that in mind, we had at that point, I think it was 7 stories. And then I ran some ideas past Sarita to say, do you think this would fit? Do you think this would fit? And she gave me so much creative freedom, for which I'm really, really incredibly grateful for, and was just like, yeah, go away and write these stories, and then we'll, reconvene. And I was really happy that all 4 of the stories that I went away and wrote made it into the collection in the end. And that was slightly in my mind, the idea, writing these 4 stories, the idea of women's sexual power was at the back of my mind, but the way in which I approached it in each story was very different. So the 4 stories that I wrote for the collection specifically were The Harp and Hot Boy, which is a very different idea of sexual power, Serpentina, which is, like, I suppose, a more obvious expression of sexual power, The Ecstasy, which I'd intended to write anyway. That was kind of always in my mind as being, because it's part 2 to a diptych, kind of religious duology. I don't even remember what was the other one I wrote. What was it? I'll never know. Oh, I'll have a look. What was it? I don't know if I have the contents in the proof. No, I think that one was in. I think the Paniettes was in it already. Waltz Romantique. That's right. It was Waltz Romantique, and that one came out of nowhere. I really wanted to write about the waltz, and also I've always had this sort of fascination with how things like war, World War I, World War II, and war in history has affected people's sexuality, and so that gave me the opportunity to kind of go down that path. But yeah, and in terms of sort of chopping and changing between characters and settings and stuff, I mean, with a short story, then I'll stay with it probably usually for between 2 weeks to a month. So it's kind of not so much of a jump, but in saying that, like in my writing life generally, you know, I juggle so many different writing roles. I'm a journalist, a ghostwriter, a short story writer, a novelist, and so and also juggling that with, like, you know, being a mum to two very demanding small people. You're constantly like putting on these different hats. So I think you just sort of instinctively find a way of going into the different zones and of being and trying to like block out everything else and give yourself wholeheartedly to whichever story it is that you're writing, whether or not, and when I say story, whether that's a journalism story as well, or the story of the book that I'm ghostwriting at the moment, that kind of thing.
Did I see one more question hand raised at back? Yeah, can I take that?
Hello. Hi. So you have to forgive me, I've not actually read this collection, but I did want to ask, so with a genre like erotica, how do you stop yourself from falling into kind of archetypes, like archetypes of what it is to be a woman or what it is to be a man, or masculinity, those kinds of things?
Oh, that's a really good question. How do you stop yourself falling into archetypes? Or I guess cliches would be like the more pejorative extension of that. Like, I think it goes back again to this idea of what do you have in your mind? What's your agenda? What's your purpose when you set out to write erotica? And I think, you know, for me, it's very much, I don't enjoy, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, the sort of very classic erotica story where you have like a young ingenue who meets a rich older man, and so I think in that sense, then I think you just sort of have to write what interests you. And I think for me, things like setting and character and diving into unusual, like far off distant worlds helps with that. But I think also that's not a dynamic. Those kind of more cliched dynamics are not things that I'm particularly interested in, that I'm particularly drawn to. So they kind of just wouldn't kind of occur to me to write something in that mode. I think, if that makes sense. Maybe it is, but that's the other thing, is that sometimes, you know, you go where your imagination takes you, and someone else can understand your story in a different way and show you what you've written that you maybe weren't even aware that you have. So I don't know, maybe some of my stories do fall into those archetypes and those cliches. No. Okay.
It's not the case. Well, thank you all for your amazing questions. Say that we are running low on time and we would love to be able to fit in one final reading from Lucy. But before then, I'd like to extend a big thank you to you for being such a wonderful audience, to our excellent performers. Big thank you to Lighthouse Books, of course, and especially the powerhouse that is Mary, and also the Assembly Roxy for making. And most of all, of course, the big thank you to Lucy herself. I'm going to leave you in her capable hands.
Thank you. Thank you. And an enormous thank you to Lindsay May. Like, what a brilliant compare of holding this thing together. Like, sexy glue. Yes, good. No, it's all right, actually. I think I can. I just keep it up. Where are we? Sorry. See, this is another reason why I would not make a burlesque performer. You just be like, right, just get it off. Okay. This is called. It would be very, very tantalizing indeed. Yes. Hang on, let me just try to undo it. Okay, this one's called The Taste. It's in 3 parts. Part 1, The Secret of the Roux. His sauce had people swooning before they even tasted it. Diners, crammed by the dozen under the restaurant's arches, watched as hundreds of beveled glass, gilt-edged reflections of themselves chewed with their eyes half closed, inhaling, trying to possess this sauce and its strange combination of flavors. The critic, Henri Leboeuf, had detected 7 notes, as he called them, in the sauce. Ox tongue, rosemary, mollusk, claret, fig, gunmetal, and caramel. But there were more. The rest, he wrote in his weekly column, is a mystery of nature. Outside, they queued in droves, harrying the maitre d'. Peasants would press their noses to the steamed glass and be hurried on by a kick from a waiter who had himself been kicked to hurry them on. Inside, the greedy diners drizzled it on everything. Suckling pig, Chantilly ice, grouse with pistachios. They scraped their plates and licked their spoons. Then they leaned over and licked the corners of their companions' lips, scooped their fingers along the dribbles on their throats and chests, hurrying to rob each last drop from one another. In the kitchen, the chef in his tall white hat left the pot on the boil and went through a tiny door that was thought to lead to the cellar. Only he knew that instead it led up a cold staircase to an attic, buffeted by the Seine's breeze through a crack in the window pane. There she lay, captive, trussed like a starfish, with kidskin straps at each of her four corners. A satin pillow under her hips he had placed there for comfort. She was, after all, his most valuable asset. She barely opened her eyes as he wet the tip of his finger. A pewter cup to hand, he pressed the spot, savouring the noise she made, and he began to harvest. Part 2, 1 year earlier. 1 minute they'd been enjoying the slow fever of complicity, plotting, cooking, mastery over the taste buds of Paris, lazy river-scented sunrises and conversations about the menu du jour over some bed snack of cured meats and buttered croissants. The next, she woke up bound. Sometime in the night, he'd taken her ankles and wrists and pulled them to a place that lay just beyond comfort. She bent a finger, touched the kidskin restraints and cried out quietly. They were soft as the skin on his sex, but without the warmth to caress. In its place, a duplicitous knot. When he emerged through the attic door that first time, crouching in his tall white hat, she tried to reason with him. But Henri Leboeuf, our repertoire, our menus. His jealous response, drink up, my love, drink up. He passed her a cup. From that day on, she remembered little, only the cool draughts of the Seine, only the howl of the hungry crowds below, the hysterical moans and grunts and laughter that lifted on the fog outside the restaurant's steamed windows. Where was his careful touch now? Where were his cool, unwrapping hands? He only ever caressed her in the one swollen spot, only with the same finger, and only with that damned pewter cup to hand. Was this what it had come to? Was she now no more than an ingredient under his chef's quick eye, his butcher's thumbs, his filleting wrists that had the strength to whip up a meringue with a wooden spoon? Had there ever been more? During her somnambulant days, drugged by the tincture and the herbs he gave her, she picked slowly back through the fish bones of the past. Was his plan there in his mind the first moment she'd clapped eyes on his whites? That day in the Chef Academy, the first time she'd noted the well-fed shape of him through the thick twill? Had he been probing his eyes beneath the chicken skin folds of her own twill, looking, sniffing for something that could sharpen his edge among the competition? And when they walked blindfolded, holding hands through Le Quartier Latin, so that only their noses could guide them to cigars, macaroons, mussels, steak frites, and wine, had he been sizing up the volume of her appetite for him? The weight of her flesh, the quantity of pleasure she was capable of producing, pleasure that he could harvest as an essence of what? Her. What would be next when the pewter cup was drained? Would he simply come for her bones? Part 3, the ingredients' revenge. She'd had enough. One day he was careless. Bending over to administer her daily sedative broth, a butter knife slipped from his pocket onto the bed. Her blood by now had acclimatized to the drugs, and they no longer had the same effect. She writhed swiftly on top of the knife. The cold metal on her skin felt like liberation. Later, she would saw the leather, arch her back. Her wolfish tooth would shine in the Seine's milk silver. The next time he opened the door, she made her usual half-eyed face. He pressed the spot, savouring the noise she made. She pressed the cold knife to the nape of his neck, the part where it joined with his spine, the bit she had long ago learned so carefully to crack on a lobster before throwing it into the pot. But Henri Leboeuf, our menus, he tried to reason with her. He's counting on our dish, our famous sauce. He hadn't banked as he reached a sly hand behind her hips that the sedative herbs would have made her quite so strong. Trust, kid-skinned, caught. She took her time about the new menus. Her taste buds, kept virgin for over a year, had grown sharp. She made dishes out of goat, pike, whipped rump steak. Sometimes she'd harvest herself with a licked finger. The customers moaned even louder. Where in the world is Chef? Wrote Henri Leboeuf. But more importantly, who's the new genius in town? She was called a wunderkind, a maestra, a messiah. After work each day, she'd carry his favoured pewter cup filled with the best wine up to that attic. There he lay, kidskin straps at each of his four corners, a hard-on the size of a beef rib protruding ripe and rosy from his handsome bush of curls. The wine to relax him, her hands would do the rest. Hands that had once tangled in his as they kneaded bread together and breathed in yeast. Hands that had picked cool vegetables from the grocer's basket for them both to sniff. She cut her nails short again for cookery, which made it easier when she rubbed and pressed and probed among his pillowed skin, his fleecy folds. Then she'd dance for him, made mad with cruelty. Her body naked, fleshed out now from the breadwork and butchery, she'd slap a thigh down either side of his neck, pull apart her lips close to his face, let him smell the delicious liquid he once loved to taste. Some punishment? That was all he got, the fruit just out of reach. Engorged to her desire, solid as gristle and burning, she'd leave him there. His knuckles clenching the kidskin, his toes strangling a dance with the bedpost, screaming louder than his customers, suspended, purgatorial, revenged. Thank you very much.